Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 11 of Series 7. The question for this evening is, can a value imperative be established as a trajectory for human existence? Reading The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 8. So last week we discussed how the question of human existence can be addressed with the concept of value. This might be unexpected because questions about value have been largely monopolised by ethics. Yet value is also essential to the activities of aesthetics, religion, motivation, meaning and purpose. That is, values not only ground ethical principles that guide moral conduct, and that a life of meaning and purpose is valuable and is lit up by value, and that in religion the central idea of God is the believer's highest value, but also that every human activity is imbued with value or values to some extent. So the need to establish a value imperative which directs our lives is an essential human endeavour. But unexpectedly, theories of ethics and aesthetics have not yet been able to establish a value imperative. This is the case for Aristotelian, utilitarian, contract, existentialist, expressivist and Kantian ethics. I cannot analyse all these theories at the moment. I have done this elsewhere. But we can look at Kantian ethics as a primary example of an attempted imperative. Kant ethics is renowned for two features that are crucial to our current topic. These are his categorical imperative and his cognitivist methods of justification. Kant's cognitivism places him on the cognitive side of the cognitive non-cognitive debate with respect to value. Kant's moral philosophy is complex, but it is formulated in his categorical imperative. A categorical imperative holds that one must act in a certain way. This is contrasted to a hypothetical imperative to act conditionally if something is the case. Philippa Foot argues that Kant's categorical imperative is really a hypothetical imperative. This is because it presupposes moral sentiments like dignity and duty. Well, this may or may not be true, but Kant's categorical imperative certainly presupposes rationality, and as we will see, this is problematic. It's problematic because of the difficulties of establishing an imperative on a cognitivist or rationalist basis. My forthcoming solution is to argue for value as a presuppositional constituent of consciousness. With respect to Kant, there are three main parts to his categorical imperative. 1. The universality of reason. I quote, "Always act so that your action becomes a universal law." 2. And the humanity aspect is to always treat humanity as an end and never merely as a means. And 3. Autonomy is expressed in free choice. That is, we must choose to give the moral law to ourselves. So Kant wrestled with the problem of how objective ethical principles could be compatible with human subjectivity. And he attempted to moderate this problem in terms of reason. And we can surmise that this was because reason had an almost unchallenged status in the early Renaissance. Thereby, Kant understandably sought an objective basis to the human activity of ethics in reason. This is because reason offers objectivity as well as being accessible as a human faculty. Alternative foundations in genetics or the social sciences weren't available at the time or are even adequate. And the idea of consciousness wasn't conceivable as a foundation of ethics in the 18th century, much as it is today. This is even though Kant's Copernican revolution gave consciousness an active role in understanding. Kant employed the concept of consciousness in epistemology, not as a foundation of moral values. Reason thereby became the foundation of Kant's ethics, which was expressed in very uncompromising ways. For example, people should be treated with complete impartiality, even in valuing the lives of family and strangers. And Kant also held that we must never lie under any circumstances. But Kant didn't regard people as logical automatons, or see the practice of ethics as without human sentiment. At the heart of his ethics was intention or goodwill, motivated by duty and the dignity of obeying the moral law. But the moral law was without exception, and human obligation was justified through reason, and the dignity of others was derived through a universalization of one's own dignity. So Kant's moral imperative is based on rationality that he expressed in terms of universalization. And although universality is essential to morality, it is an assumed criterion with dubious applications. That is, universality is implausible in actual applications, but possible in fundamental human drives. Criticisms of Kantian ethics can be made in different ways, yet here I'm only focusing on cognition and reason. Neo-Kantians such as R.D. Ross and Christine Kosgard have supported Kant, but not with agreed success. Against Kant, Hume argued that a prescriptive moral ought can't be derived from a factual is nor from reason. Hume's law or principle has never been unseated and thought proven by More's naturalistic fallacy. And on reading Hume, Kant said that he had been awoken from a dogmatic slumber. Yet cognitivists like Kant explain morals and motivation primarily in terms of reason and certain conceptions. Hume represents the non-cognitivist view, which seeks explanations primarily in terms of affect and feeling. Cognitivists suppose that a certain conception of things is by itself sufficient to motivate moral action. Kant thereby holds that we ought to follow the moral law just because we understand that the law is right. And because we understand that the moral law is right, it is our duty to practice it. This is contentious, yet we can make a comparison with the case of motivation rather than moral motivation. The question, or one question that we can consider here is, do we eat an apple because we desire it or just because we see an apple? In this case, non-cognitivist motivation from desire is intuitively correct, but moral motivation is more complex and difficult to ascertain. Kant's project attempted to explain how moral objectivity could be binding on us, and he tried to do this by showing how reason can produce a categorical or moral imperative. And this is what is part of what has become known as the cognitive non-cognitive debate. Analytic philosophy typically classifies consciousness into these two cognitive and non-cognitive mental states. But this classification is biased towards cognitivism and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So I supplement this classification using the four states of cognition, affect, will and value. The problem of human existence as consciousness can now be given greater specificity using these four states. My project is to work out solutions, primarily in terms of value, with reference to these other states. And this four-state classification enables me to argue for the priority of value over the other three states. So I will briefly outline these three states as possible foundations of a human imperative. Starting with cognition, the cognitive-non-cognitive debate is long-standing and too extensive to outline here. Yet we have already begun an analysis above in discussing Hume and Kant. Briefly, non-cognitive theories are said to be blind and unable to guide action. Yet cognitive theories are said to be impotent and unable to motivate actions or morals. And cognitive reason is widely accepted as a means towards some end. Yet cognition has more complex functions than these, which I would want to discuss in due course. That is, cognition not only functions as reason in means to an end, but as structural and supportive functions. And this relation of functions in an ongoing dialectic between cognitive frameworks and value states. For example, new theories and ideas generate great excitement and are even promoted as solutions in themselves. But the satisfactions do not result from the intrinsic character of these cognitions that are contingent. They result from the fact that a desired objective or value has been apprehended. And in my view, this denotes cognition as a primary human drive or imperative. Like cognition, the significance of the will depends on its function and how it is used and qualified. The will or volition is a variable state, ranging from Nietzsche's will to power to Kant's goodwill. And as an objective and a noun, the will is an essential ingredient in the motivation of an action. Yet in this context, the will is also a verb with a volitional function within an imperative. In these ways, the will can either be an objective or an essential volitional component within an imperative. Yet in both these ways, the will is a vehicle or an intermediary rather than a constituting an imperative. And as such, the will also isn't a viable candidate as a primary human drive or imperative. But we are moving through these topics much too quickly because of the limitations of time. Yet I will comment on the will again shortly. Affect states are emotions and feelings like pleasure and happiness, as well as negative states like pain and disgust. Happiness is a prime example of an affect state as a classic human objective and an undeniable human good. It is endorsed by consensus, the American Constitution, and Aristotelian and even Kantian ethics. Happiness also figures in utilitarianism in its central principle of utility, where it can be debated in more detail. Yet as social policy, the maximum happiness for the maximum number of people is difficult to dispute. But as a theory of ethics, it has serious inadequacies of quantification, justification and motivation. Yet my main criticism is that happiness is blind, doesn't entail value and doesn't answer the why or how of life. It is of course very nice to be happy, and the desire to be happy is a valid motivating force. But its limitations exclude it as a primary value or imperative to direct human existence. Yet we must consider the outsider's view that the pursuit of such a value imperative is futile and misguided. But the outcome of that criticism must at least wait until some outcome of these arguments. Moreover, the complexities of life indicate that we might be mistaken in looking for one salient feature. Yet that doesn't prevent us from considering each of these states in turn, or from considering them in combination, as I eventually do in the idea of an ongoing dialectic, and that with value these four states are the building blocks of a more complex position. Yet if cognition, affect, will aren't viable objectives, then consciousness itself might be posed as an objective. But consciousness or its increase isn't a viable objective or solution in itself for the following reasons. One, it doesn't in itself specify or contain the particular properties that may provide resolution. Two, it incurs problems like anxiety, anomie, fragmentation, alienation, guilt, and awareness of finitude. Three, structures like temporality, divisibility, and graduation render consciousness intrinsically problematic. Yet consciousness does offer capacities like reason and abstraction that facilitate the solving of problems. Cognitivist, rationalist, emotivist, and volitional means of establishing an imperative are thereby ruled out. And the outcome of this section is that knowledge, happiness, the will to power, or higher levels of consciousness don't offer either a definitive human objective or a basis for a conclusive imperative for action. On my thinking shared by others, these things can only be established on the basis of value. So I'll now consider four alternative ways of establishing a value imperative. One way, as above, is to eliminate alternative possibilities, leaving only value as a possible imperative. That is, given that cognition, affect and will exhaustively describe the content of consciousness, then a human imperative could only be obtained from the realm of value and value states. But this approach only establishes value as a possibility, not as an imperative. Another way is to establish value as an ineradicable constituent of consciousness and as an incessant driving force. I will try to do this with Heidegger's care as the being of Dasein and Sartre's being of the self as value. But in themselves, these explanations do not establish any value imperative or motivational force. A third way is to show how value, anachronistically like mathematics, can be self-validating, and that not to value value is contradictory, self-negating, self-defeating, and ultimately erroneous. But these are negative constraints, and again do not establish any value imperative. So a final method of establishing a value imperative is by choice in consideration of the above factors. And choice mitigates the is-ought constraint as well as deferring to concerns from Kant to the existentialists. That is, Kant's categorical imperative holds that we must choose to give the moral law to ourselves. Yet for Kant, that choice must concur with the moral law as universality and humanity. In my view, that choice must concur with the character of consciousness and value. So I first want to establish value as a constituent of consciousness that we can then take further as an imperative. This amplifies the elimination of other candidate states above and the forthcoming arguments for value. Another consequence is that we are beginning with value, not fact, thereby mitigating the is-ought problem. To initiate this view, I can take an argument from Sartre that the being of the self as consciousness is value, and that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values, unquote. Sartre builds on the idea of contrast, choice and selection as constituents of both value and consciousness. He holds choice as just not preference but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. Sartre wants to trace selection to its ontological foundation, but he doesn't do this explicitly. But we can explain and extend the notions of choice and selection with the concept of contrast. That is, monotone is inimical to selection, choice, value, perception, and indeed to consciousness. These capacities need contrast like a black spot on a white board. We can then say that every perception entails contrast, selection, elimination, and value. We look one way and make a selection and preference, and that selection produces an antithesis or negation. Selection entails preference and value. Elimination implies contrast as a precondition of value. These may be just nascent values, yet that is to be expected when explaining the origins of value. And the implications of such nascent values are taken further with temporality as a structure of consciousness. Martin Heidegger and Edmund Husserl offer an account of time that extends the implications of value. Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being. Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. That is, we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through diversity in space. So values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of existence. And these values must be increasingly significant to meet the demands of life. Heidegger's and Sartre's account show how value is a fundamental drive with potential implications. We can also do this by returning to another interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power. Heidegger rejects Nietzsche's will to power as overbearing, and he interprets it as the will to will. And Nietzsche's will to power is also over-inclusive of every activity, and it is naturalistic. That is, Nietzsche's affinity to power led him to view the will to power as a pervasive force in all biological life. as a biological drive, the will to power is thereby excluded as a moral principle by such as Hume and More. Yet the will to power can be seen as control over one's very limbs and over the environment in which we live. And as selection, choice and control, the will to power can again be seen as compatible with the will to value. Then, as an aspect of biology, we can ask whether animals have values or even have a will to value. Animals don't have the capacities of abstraction or free will, and thereby don't have moral values. But animals have desires expressed in instincts, in reproduction, hunger, and the avoidance of pain. Therefore, animals can be said to have values, but not the moral values or the affirmation of values. The idea of animals having values reinforces the notion of value as a fundamental aspect of human life. That is, values are so fundamental to self-conscious human life, they are also found in conscious animal life. But this doesn't yet mean that we must choose or adopt value as an overriding principle. And we haven't yet established what guides those values or what gives them normative or motivational content. One way is with a value theory ethic, using a principle of value and pragmatically choosing our best actions. Another is to use the principle of value sufficiency with a proclivity towards more sufficient values. But such principles depend upon a further principle that we must now establish. The principle I'm talking about is the pursuit of value, the affirmation of value, the will to value, or to value value. Robert Nozick speaks of valuing values. I'm talking about valuing value as a general principle. Yet each of these different descriptions has different connotations that I will clarify later. I will first outline 4 reasons why not to value value is contradictory, self-defeating, self-negating and erroneous. And these thereby become reasons to value value as well as a justification for the choice of value. Firstly, it is erroneous to take instrumental or attributed values as objective or intrinsic values. Obvious examples are taking money or gold as having intrinsic value only done by misers or children. Less egregious is attributing intrinsic value to houses or paintings or even to truth or beauty. So this error is made on a graduated or a sliding scale of culpability. Sartre speaks of refraining from appropriating things for their own sake, replacing their symbolic meaning. Sartre's notion of a spirit of seriousness illustrates 2 such ways of failing to value value. The spirit of seriousness is to misrepresent subjective values as objective to avoid freedom and responsibility. The classic example is to say, in bad faith, I have no choice. This makes a supposed error of taking the idea of I have no choice as an objective fact or value. This is a failure to value value because it is a refusal to choose, which is a fundamental property of value. Yet it is also a failure to value value because it is valuing an object or principle which has no value in itself. That is, on Mackey's and other arguments, only people and mental states are candidates of intrinsic value. On this view, principles or objects only have instrumental value attributed to them by people. So to take principles or objects as having intrinsic value is erroneous. Secondly, not to value value is contradictory because value must be presupposed by any system of value judgments. For example, we saw earlier how value can be selected from the other states of cognition, will and affect. And not to value value is contradictory because we have already chosen value as the sphere of operations. So it would be contradictory not to affirm value as the determining principle of that sphere. To explain further, other presuppositional features are also cited, like language, knowledge or truth. That is, such features are needed to provide explanations or to undertake inquiries. But these do not explicitly presuppose the value that we are looking for in our inquiry. This view of value or morals as a distinct realm is also held by Ronald Dworkin's interpretation of Hume. Dworkin presents Hume's principle as not just skepticism about morals, but having a positive aspect. That is, the idea of the independence of morality as a separate department of knowledge, unquote. And that moral claims require moral arguments to justify or refute them. And in this way, claims about value presuppose an acceptance of the concept of value. And therefore, in such contexts, not to value value is contradictory. Thirdly, not to value value is self-defeating due to the claim that value is the culminating state of human satisfaction. This claim rests on arguments that I have given elsewhere and in other workshops. But we can begin to outline them by reiterating how primary human activities produce value satisfactions. That is, God is the believer's highest value, ethical principles are values that guide moral action, purpose is directed towards some value, and a meaningful life is also valuable and worthwhile. Yet these and other examples also lead to value satisfactions that I have described as value sufficiency. That is, the idea of God is not only the believer's highest value, it is also characterized by sufficiency. And Aristotle's eudaimonia is the supreme good, which he also qualifies as self-sufficient. And as the supreme good is a moral concept, it can be inferred to be a sufficiency of value. And my central claim is also that the affirmation of value, or the value of value, results in a certain sufficiency of value. Sufficiencies of value are value states like self-esteem, dignity, courage, patience and magnanimity. But I'm reluctant to describe this as the will to value, which has Nietzschean connotations of unbridled power, whereas the value of value leading to sufficiency isn't a maximization or quantification of value. Conversely, it accommodates ulteriority, absence and quality of value. And human finitude means that sufficiencies are always insufficient and are works in progress. The above are comparative justifications of valuing value and value sufficiency as culminating human satisfactions. Yet I always want to give internal or phenomenal reasons for justifying such values. That is, valuing value has a proclivity towards substantive or sufficient values like moral fortitude and magnanimity. This is because valuing is a process that has a trajectory and directional content that aggregates values. For example, the pursuit of money, not at all wrong in itself, narrows interests to the financial sphere, and ethical pursuits develop moral and other human values. We can reiterate Sartre's advice here of refraining from appropriating things for their own sake. And Carl Gustav Jung spoke of individuation, or what we might call a synthesis of value promoted by valuing value. That is, to consciously or unconsciously value what you really value is a developmental process. My point here is that valuing value is a process that leads to more substantive and sufficient value. And not to value value is thereby self-defeating in that it leads away from greater human satisfaction. And fourthly, not to value value is self-negating because it is a self-validating principle. That is, its justification can be derived from within the realm of value itself, as Dworkin has suggested. And this is why the term valuing value can be preferred to the affirmation of value or pursuing value. And this moderates both the problems of a hypothetical imperative and the is or distinction. The fact-value distinction is not the same as the more onerous is-ought form, with moral and motivational demands. Yet I have argued above that values have implications which convert them into ought obligations. I've similarly argued for such implications in the presentation of a value theory ethics. I will now finally look at the problem of justification in the idea of value or valuing value as a self-validating principle. Self-validating principles are found in logic and mathematics, but not thought possible in physics or ethics. Self-validation can be established in logic and mathematics by non-contradiction. For example, logic is determined by the self-evident and self-validating truths of Aristotle's 4 basic principles of logic. David Hilbert described mathematics as avoidance of contradiction and is therefore a self-validating a priori. A self-validating system within the human sphere is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Physics, though, isn't self-validating because it's an a posteriori system of contingent observations. Mathematics and logic are self-validating but can't establish principles for systems of physics or ethics. But I propose that the will to value is self-validating because the alternative is contradictory and self-negating. And further, the valuing of value isn't a tautology as might be thought. It isn't a tautology because value can affirm value or not, as the system of value of which it is a part. And it is possible to value value due to our reflective consciousness. That is, our reflective consciousness can affirm or negate aspects of our own minds. But as noted earlier, it is called to affirm or value the system of value of which it is a part or which it has chosen. And this is comparable in a way to the I think, therefore I am, because value itself presupposes valuing value. And therefore not to value value is contradictory and self-negating. We can summarize the above 4 reasons for avoiding not valuing value as follows. Values are erroneous when instrumental or attributed values are taken to be objective or intrinsic values. Not to value value is contradictory because value must be presupposed by any system of value judgments. Not to value value is self-defeating due to the claim that value is the culminating state of human satisfaction. And fourthly, not to value value is self-negating because it is a self-validating principle. To these reasons, we must add the further finding that cognition, affect, will, and even consciousness itself are inadequate grounds for a human imperative, and that value is the best candidate for such in the form of a value imperative. But these are the facts of the matter laid out before us, yet without the crucial imperative that we must adopt them. So here finally we are called to make a pragmatic choice about the best thing that we can do, and the best choice is to adopt value as a principle to value value. Not to adopt the best choice is a negation of value and a self-defeating negation of oneself. The choice for value also mitigates the is-ought constraint by accepting value instead of fact as the initial premise. This resolves Kant's problem of trying to establish a categorical imperative based on reason. So my final method of establishing a value imperative is by choice in consideration of the above factors. And choice mitigates the is-ought constraint as well as deferring to concerns from Kant to the existentialists. That is, Kant's categorical imperative holds that we must choose to give the moral law to ourselves. Yet for Kant, that choice must concur with the moral law as universality and humanity. In my view, that choice must concur with the character of consciousness and value. I can also conclude by admitting that the arguments presented above are not totally conclusive. This might be expected given that philosophy in general has not been able to establish a value imperative. So any arguments in this respect must thereby be tentative, but hopefully prescient. These are again that value fulfills human needs over cognition, affect, will, and even consciousnness. That not to value value is erroneous, contradictory, self-negating, and self-defeating. That an affirmation of value as the pragmatic best choice resolves the problem of arbitrary choice, and making value our premise, we also resolve the fact value and is-ought problems. Yet a value imperative does more than resolve problems of ethics, meaning and purpose. As a constituent of consciousness, of life, and of the totality of things in the world, a value imperative also establishes a trajectory for human existence. So the imperative advanced here is a hypothetical imperative that becomes a categorical imperative on certain conditions. Those conditions are a recognition of value as a definitive drive and the will to enact that drive in one's life. So let me have your comments and criticisms on websites like meetup.com or the Philosophy of Value workshops.